Look at that. Oh, okay, we learned a lesson. Don't do that. Hello and welcome to Snacks, the cooking recipe series that I have going here on YouTube. My name's Justine. I go by Justine Snacks on Instagram, thus the name. And if you cannot tell by our setup, we are doing another bread episode. This one, a little simpler than sourdough, which is why I'm giving you two breads in one. Well, kind of. We are doing two types of focaccia. We are doing the famous no-knead focaccia that you've probably seen a million recipes for. And then we are doing my personal favorite, a Genoa-style focaccia. Because I put it out on TikTok, I was like, do you prefer like a thick and fluffy focaccia? Or do you prefer like a thin and crispy focaccia? Like the focaccia for straight up breading or the focaccia for like sandwiching and toasting? Two very different focaccias, both made with very, very similar recipes. So the Genoa-style focaccia uses a stand mixer, which we'll do a little bit later. And then we're gonna start with the no-knead focaccia, which is very true to its name. We kind of just like mix a bunch of things together and let them do their job. So the main staples of focaccia, we're gonna be using bread flour. A lot of recipes call for all-purpose flour. I like to use bread flour. It's just that extra level of protein that adds to the gluten, and especially in a no-knead focaccia, where we aren't doing much to develop any gluten, I really like using bread flour. And then we have active dry yeast, sea salt, sugar just for the no-knead recipe, and then of course water. So that's all the ingredients. We're going super complicated. We might mess around with the toppings later, but those are the basics for both focaccias. Now, for the no-knead focaccia, we're gonna do a lot of talking about gluten, but I will bore you with that a little bit later on. First, we need to activate our yeast. So what I'm taking here is 600 grams of warm water. 85 degrees to 95 degrees is my sweet spot for activating yeast. Yeast dies at 140 degrees. It's very sad. You throw a funeral. So we're trying to keep everything below 115 degrees to stay safe. So let's get to 600. Adding in a tablespoon, which is about 12 grams of just white sugar. You can also do honey. I'm gonna mix that in to let it dissolve. And then we are taking 7 grams of yeast, the one thing I pre-measured, and evenly layer that on top. Now, I use this yeast all the time. I know it is pretty active, but if you don't bake often, give this about 5 minutes to get super bubbly, so then you know that your yeast is fresh and ready for use. The worst thing would be to like make your loaf and then realize that your yeast is dead when your loaf isn't rising. So give it about 5 minutes. While that's doing its thing, we are going to measure out the bread flour and the salt. So focaccia is a high hydration dough. If you've heard me talk about baker's ratios before, it's where you measure everything as a percentage of the amount of flour. So for this, we're using 650 grams of flour because it's going to be a thick, fluffy focaccia, like the kind you can boing, for lack of a better word, but the kind you can like stretch down and it'll puff up. And we are going to be then using 600 grams of water. So that puts us at around 92% hydration, which for reference, most breads are at about 80% hydration. So focaccia is a high hydration dough, and especially this no-knead version, that's to help us develop a ton of gluten and also a ton of like fluffy, beautiful, gorgeous bubbles. It'll make like a really nice, like chewy, but also light focaccia. I'm gonna run out of descriptors for focaccia by the end of this episode, so let's just bang them all out now. Chewy, crispy, light, fluffy, airy, flavorful, oily in a good way, and delicious. You're gonna be hearing all of those on repeat. I'm using the same brand of flour, King Arthur. We love them. They don't know I exist. They're not sponsoring this. But if by chance they stumble upon this, call me. 650 grams of bread flour. Now, salt is actually something that aids in gluten formation. So when it comes to bread recipes in general, I like to add salt early. You'll see a lot of people do different things. It's really up to personal preference, but especially in a no-knead recipe, I like to get that salt in early. And you can see our yeast starting to bubble around the top. As soon as you see that kind of action, that means your yeast is alive, you are ready to go. So from there, I just pour the mixture directly into the flour. No tricks, nothing crazy. You can use a spatula for this part. I like to mix with my hands. I wish I could give you a reason why. I just really like to mix with my hands. And this dough is gonna be wet. When I say 92% hydration, that means like the water is almost the same amount of flour. We're just gonna mix until the flour is completely hydrated. And then give it a few stretches. And don't tell me that counts as kneading. To me, it just counts as insurance. And then we're gonna let it refrigerate overnight before baking. Now, you might be familiar with the Sullivan Street Baking Company no-knead bread method, which actually uses a minuscule amount of yeast and lets bread rise at room temperature for 24 hours before you shape the loaf. And that recipe, you don't even touch it. And what's interesting about that is how it approaches gluten formation. Now, gluten formation is formed by two proteins that you find in wheat flour, which is gliadin and glutenin. The second name is definitely easier to remember. But as soon as water hits wheat flour, like connects, those two proteins will start creating long gluten strands. That's called gluten formation. It happens if you need it. It happens if you don't need it. It's going to occur anytime that you hydrate wheat, which is why I always think of gluten as something that we really need to be thinking about more when we're baking like brownies or cookies or like anything. We have to worry about gluten formation, either if you want to strengthen it or inhibit it. But what's interesting about gluten formation is most of us think that to make it happen, you have to really knead and work or use a mixer to like mix a dough. And that's true, because as you mix any dough, that's helping strengthen those protein strands and help like encourage the chewiness of the final outcome of the dough. But what else also builds gluten is time. So for these no-knead recipes, you'll notice that we just let the dough ferment for an extended period of time. And in this dough's case, which I should probably stop mixing it to prove my point, we're using a high amount of yeast and we're using a cold fermentation time. So it's kind of cool. So the gluten will continue to build as time goes on, and the yeast will be working at a slower pace because it's in a cold temperature. Whereas with the no-knead Sullivan Street bread method, they're using like no amount of yeast, so it needs to be at room temperature to reach that rise. So for this simple AF recipe, I'm giving you a incredibly long explanation because that's what you come here for, right? And my personality. I need to wash this hand. And now enter scene the first time we are going to be seeing olive oil in this recipe, and it's gonna keep coming back a lot. This time we're just doing a thin layer. Alexa, stop. Our oven is preheated. This time I'm doing a thin-ish layer in a bowl, and then I'm just gonna ease this guy into it. You can see I used a little bit of oil on the tips of my fingers to help get this out without it sticking to me. It'll still stick, again, because we're working at 92% hydration. But getting a little more oil on my fingers and just pulling it away from the sides of the bowl. Because this bowl is what is going to be its home for the next like 12 to 18 hours. So make sure that it's not stuck to the sides as much as possible. And now I'm just gonna cover it with a towel and give it 10 minutes to rest, and then we're gonna do stretch and fold. 10 minutes to rest, stretch and fold, and then we're done with it. Put it in the fridge until we want to eat it. Okay, so it's been 10 minutes, and we're just gonna do some gentle stretch and folds. I know that makes it not a total no-knead bread, but I think it encourages some nice structure in the dough, which I really like to have, especially if it's some type of bread that I'm basically kind of just mixing and let it do its own thing. So a classic stretch and fold, I got my method from Ken Forkish's book, but a classic stretch and fold is just stretching this big part up and folding it over. Got some stickage. Gonna wet my hand. Then you rotate 90 degrees, another stretch, another fold. You're gonna get some oil in it. Don't stress it. This dough will have plenty of oil in it in the end. And then another stretch and fold. And then another stretch and fold. And you can see how the dough is kind of just like encapsulating. This will be the last one because I can feel everything start to tighten. And then what I'm gonna do is scoop it up and kind of create a nice little seam at the bottom. So you can see it just like turned into this beautiful shape, and we already built up so much structure in like 20 seconds of time and no heavy lifting. It's just like a gentle way to coax the dough into a nice shape. And we'll do that one more time before we let her go into her 12-hour to 18-hour overnight proof. Okay, we've stretched and folded it, nestled it into like a kind of dough ball thing. Now, in a perfect world, we're gonna let this rest overnight or 12 to 18 hours. I'll put a sample schedule in the section below. So, in your world, it has been 12 to 18 hours. In our world, it has been 10 minutes because I prepped a swap. But we have let the no-knead dough, which is gigantic, proof in your fridge overnight, and she's full of life. You can see we got a lot going on. Normally, I would tell you don't mess with the bubbles, but if you have like pretty gigantic ones like this, I would pop. Let's do my favorite thing, which is talking about what you probably shouldn't do, but what I'm gonna do anyways. I'm using a glass 8 by 16, I think, I need to confirm, 16 or 15 inch pan. Now, the glass is like not my favorite for baking. It never has been. It's like a very rare use baking tool because it takes a long time to heat up and it takes a long time to cool down, which is can kind of mess with your temperatures. But I kind of treat it the same way that people do with cast iron focaccia baking, but just like when you don't preheat the cast iron, because cast iron acts the same way if you aren't preheating it in the oven. Essentially, what I'm trying to tell you is if you have a tin pan, that's a better option here. In this gigantic kitchen of tools, don't have a tin pan that will fit this like height of focaccia, so we're just gonna use glass. And we're just gonna show that you can do whatever you want with subpar materials. Where I will say I don't want you to skip is the olive oil. I love Enzo's Table. They also make really good almond butter. They're a California-based brand. You've heard me say this before. I really, really like California olive oils, especially if you are in the States. They tend to be fresher than Italian-sourced olive oils if you're in the United States. Different story if you're across the globe, which if you are, hello. So now taking this focaccia, I'm gonna oil my hand a little bit. And like we said earlier, this is gonna be our gigantic fluffy focaccia. Oh my God. Dough is so incredibly satisfying. So we have a few more bubbles. I'm just popping those down. This is cold because it did rise in the fridge over the night. I don't know why I would assume that you would not think it is cold. Anyways, so the gluten has also had time to rest and relax, but it's still gonna be a bit hard for us to stretch this out. So if you're having trouble getting this all the way to the edges, just like let it sit for a few minutes. The gluten will continue to relax and then we can pull it all the way to the edges. We're gonna let it rise one more hour. So I already started preheating my oven to 425. And then for this second rise, we are gonna use plastic wrap because our bread is pretty olive oily. And if it does rise and hits the plastic wrap, we'll be able to just pull it off super easily. Whereas if I were to use a tea towel, we'd risk the chance of sticking, and we don't want that at this point. So, room temperature rise, it's gonna get, I'd say, 1.5 times bigger, and then we're gonna bake it. It wouldn't be a focaccia episode if we didn't at least talk about the toppings. I love a naked focaccia, but I'm also making this no-knead one a little bit spicy, a little bit special. So I got these Aleppo paprika peppers. Well, it's Aleppo and paprika, different peppers. And I'm gonna toast those with fenugreek, coriander, a little bit of black peppercorns, and some red pepper flakes. And then I'm gonna grind those with my mortar and pestle and use that as the topping. It's kind of like inspired by ajika, which is a Georgian seasoning. It's a seasoning paste, but this will be just like a little spice mix that we can put on top. There's still some Aleppo pepper in there, but we're just gonna leave the chunks or else I'm gonna be here all day. Then I'm adding some salt. And I think our bread is ready. And this focaccia has risen about 1.5 times in size. It's really jiggly. You can see all the bubbles. up top. This guy, I'm just mentally preparing you. It's gonna rise even more. This guy's gonna be thick. So now, it is the best time. It is my favorite time. It is dimpling time. To walk you through dimpling, we're essentially creating more crevices for wonderful olive oil, wonderful toppings, just an extra way to get texture to the dough, and of course, make it a focaccia. We're just gonna pour a little bit of that good olive oil on top. Get our fingers a little olive oily. Dimple a reasonable amount, otherwise you're gonna lose all the bubbles. Top to your heart's desire. I'm going on thick. And then we're gonna put it in the oven at 425 and timer for 20 minutes. And I didn't say this, but center rack. It's not super important, but it's kind of important. Extra floofy, extra crispy focaccia is out of the oven. I told you it would rise. It did. It domes a little, but that's like totally fine. If you do want to make, excuse you, that was my timer, which is a good sign to keep an eye on it. The spice is singed a little on the top, but I'm not mad at that. That means they'll be crispy and delicious. I'm gonna let it cool before I remove it. That's another thing. If you are baking any type of focaccia, you gotta give it a few minutes before you get it out of its like little oil well. But when we slice into it, this one's gonna be great. Okay, we let it cool for I'd say a good 20-25 minutes, but you can wait 15 because like bread. Can't beat these bubbles. The sign of a good one is you still have like big bubbles and then like clusters of dense, chewy focaccia bread goodness. Of course, the spring. It is insanely good. Why wouldn't it be? Now onto recipe number 2, but just like give me a few minutes with this bread. Thank you. Okay, so you saw our no-knead focaccia. Now we're going to do our classic style focaccia, which technically is also no-knead because we are using a stand mixer. But if you aren't using a stand mixer, then it's gonna be a highly intensely kneaded focaccia. So just like the no-knead focaccia, we are really focusing on developing gluten with this focaccia. But unlike the no-knead focaccia, instead of using time, here we are using brute force, strength of will, and a little bit of time. So what the no-knead focaccia used was 18 hours of overnight proofing for gluten development. We are using 15 minutes of strong mixing. You'll see what happens when we get there, but I've measured everything out, so it should be super easy to just go into it. I'm using the dough hook attachment on my stand mixer. That is all you're going to need. And let's start right away with the yeast. So I'm actually using 3.5 grams of yeast, because this is going to be a baby focaccia. It's about half the size of the no-knead focaccia, but it is still 92% hydration, so it's gonna be a little wet. But to activate the yeast, I'm starting with 60 grams of warm water. We're just gonna mix it on low to get it combined. Very low, just to get everything together. And unlike the no-knead recipe, we're not adding sugar to activate the yeast because actually yeast naturally activates from the sugars in wheat flour, so you don't actually need it. That recipe just calls for it because I wanted it to be very active, very bubbly, very big, but this one we definitely don't need that. I'm gonna give our yeast a few minutes to just like do its thing, and then we're going to straight in add the flour, salt, and water. 390 grams of bread flour, half a tablespoon, so around 7 grams of sea salt, 300 grams of water, making the total 360 grams. So you might be tempted to scrape down the sides. I almost was. I got out my tiny spatula, but you really don't need to. Trust the dough hook. You can see it is wet, what we are working with right now. So I'm just gonna make sure that all the flour is fully saturated. We're gonna let this sit for about 15 minutes. I'm gonna cover it loosely with something. There's really no purpose to that other than making sure that nothing gets in our dough, but we're letting it sit for 15 minutes, kind of like a mini autolyse, which is where you just mix water and flour, but since we already added everything, it's not technically an autolyse, but we're just letting the dough relax because just like I said earlier with the no-knead recipe, we have gluten in here, gliadin, and what we're gonna do is just continue to mix them, and that's going to allow those proteins to link together, develop long chains, start creating gluten, and really get into that gluten development. 10 minutes has passed. Now we lock it in. We go up to medium high, and it feels more aggressive than it actually is, but the dough will start to pull away from the sides. Let this work for like 10 to 15 minutes, or until it starts to clump as a ball in the middle. So I'll see you in 15 minutes. We almost lost the table with that one. I think it's ready. It's been 16 minutes. We should have a very long gloop. You can kind of see I can pull it like that, and that means it's got enough gluten for its first rise. And since we built up all the gluten in this initial beating process, because I can't use a gentler term, that was like a very intense 15 minutes, we really only let it rise once, and then we put it in its little pan, and then we let it rise again, getting that good olive oil, lining a bowl, and very similar to the no-knead bread, we're gonna swirl to make sure it's pretty coated, and then place the dough in there. And then we'll cover it and let it rest for 1 hour or until doubled in size. It has been a little over an hour because it was kind of cold in here, but you're looking for super jiggly, very bubbly. It's designed for a 9x13 pan, and you can tell that this is a much shallower pan than the other pan situation we were working with, and that's because this is going to be a much shallower focaccia, but same rules apply. Really good olive oil, a liberal coating, and then this is incredibly gloop. We're just gonna ease it on down. Just gonna stretch it out just like we did with the other focaccia. And we're doing another cover with plastic wrap moment, and I'm gonna be completely honest because since this is a tutorial, I believe in transparency. We did overproof this just a little bit. You don't want as many bubbles this early, but this is a great way to show you that focaccia is not a super volatile bread. So instead of doing the hour proof, the spread, and then another hour proof, we are gonna do a 30-minute-ish proof while the oven preheats, and then dimple it. It'll have a pretty similar result. We're not gonna like ruin the bread, and that's just like, it's just a good thing to know that focaccia is like a great starter bread. Saran wrap off. Then we're gonna use the very last of the bottle olive oil, and then dimpling all the way to the bottom on this one. You can really top with anything. You've seen me make a parsley oil that would be great on this. Of course, a lot of people like to do a basil oil because that's a classic. A lot of people like to do fresh veggies like zucchini, tomato in the summer. It's not the summer yet, but I'm waiting for it. I'm just doing the classic and ever popular flaky salt. I don't know why I had any doubts. Me mess up a focaccia? Impossible. And same with you. You really can't mess this one up, especially because the mixer does all the work. I'm gonna be completely transparent. I was panicking. I was like, I overproofed it, but you save it in the end. And what I like about this dough is it goes from super slack, and since it's so shallow that it just like comes together into a really nice focaccia. I need to look into getting sound effect noises in post-production, so I'm not making my own sound effects. But this is smoking, smoking, smoking hot. But you can see, unlike the other one, it just slides off because it's just like so thin and compact. And this is more along the lines of like what you would see considered traditional focaccia. I think in the States we get it confused a lot and think focaccia needs to be like pretty thick, but this is what I call the Genoa-style focaccia on my blog, where it's thinner, it's good for sandwiches. Like I even read that in Italy sometimes it's eaten with cappuccino for breakfast. Like they have tons of varieties over there, but this is very like crispy and then like a very nice fluffy interior, and you can really use it for all sorts of things. I'm gonna give it 2 minutes to cool, and then we're gonna slice into it, experience the magic of the crisp, and then that's like 2 focaccias in one video. I hope I didn't talk your ears off about gluten, even though I probably did. Okay, it is gonna be crispy. At my funeral, if they're asking for like good photos of me, can you just like this clip right here with these? This is how I want to be remembered, with my crispy focaccia that I am so happy that I made. And you also have the no-knead version now. You have this version now. You have everything in the caption below if you want to make it. And I hope you learned a lot about gluten. And I know gluten-free queens, you're probably like, well, gluten-free viewers, all of you are royalty. You're probably like, what about gluten-free? I'm working on it. It's gonna be like the sourdough recipe where you wait 5 months for the video and then the video hits and it's amazing. So give me some time. But in the meantime, I hope you liked this very gluten-y video. I hope you try at least one of the recipes. I hope you also like and subscribe because we're coming out with these at least 3 Tuesdays a month and I'm having so much fun making them. So I hope to see you in the next video.